Within the larger Midland and Odessa battle space, with the backdrop of many other objectives in the process of being taken at the very opening of the nationwide invasion within the South Central invasion sector, and within it, the Midland and Odessa campaign primary battle space, wherein the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division, comprised of its 2 brigades, with its 1st Brigade responsible for the Odessa half of the battle space and its 2nd Brigade responsible for the Midland side, now going for the jugular as the nationwide invasion had initiated at the stroke of midnight on October the 4th, as the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes had completely taken down the nation's ISR and communications capabilities, with the exception of redundant communications, which were handled in each and every battle space by electronic warfare assets dedicated to the role of completely jamming and disrupting redundant communications such as radio, as well as even redundant ISR capabilities such as portable radars that were generator powered, as well as also drones that could be operated by either civilian or military assets, or even American alphabet paramilitary forces, which were also, along with the military, a portion of the overall regime security forces in the country. As the Y-9LG dedicated electronic warfare / electronic intelligence aircraft was orbiting this battle space to provide these capabilities in order to remove redundant communications in ISR, the Americans were left completely blind and in the dark and unable to effectively communicate with one another except for any form of messenger-based communications, which could be carried out through vehicles of different types or by runners on foot, as well as also earshot and line-of-sight communications. In other words, America had effectively been thrust back into the Stone Age. In terms of all of the major objectives and flank clearance operations now erupting throughout the battle space, one major objective, which was the downtown of the city of Midland itself, would be carried out in terms of its capture and clearance by 2 battalions from within the 2nd Brigade of the larger 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division, as the 2nd Brigade had dedicated one of its light mechanized infantry battalions as well as one of its armored battalions to the objective of capturing and clearing the city of Midland of all resistance forces, as the defending forces within the city were primarily comprised of American alphabet paramilitary forces, as these forces had been deployed to the area and effectively set up in their allotted structures or their offices in terms of the DEA, IRS, and even U.S. Marshals services, which were located in the city of Midland, as the battle was to erupt in 2 phases, as the 2 different battalions had different capabilities, with the light mechanized infantry battalion a much faster and far more mobile strike force than were the armored forces, who, although very powerful in terms of their weaponry equipped, moved far slower, as the rapidity of the wheeled-based forces of the light mechanized infantry battalion allowed their combat elements to rapidly move to their given objectives and strike with a high degree of surprise and shock and awe, as they were highly trained in urban warfare and building assault concepts, as they were the selected force to effectively race into the heart of the city and carry out assaults on the paramilitary forces in their own buildings. As again, Phase 1 would be carried out by the light mechanized infantry battalion racing into the heart of the city to conduct a cordon, which effectively would be a circle in terms of its envelopment, which would have a 5-mile diameter, carried out by 5 out of 6 dedicated light mechanized infantry combat companies, which would rapidly move into the city with one of 6 companies breaking up into its 3 combat platoons and headquarters platoon to carry out building assaults against the paramilitary forces who were to be attacked immediately and surgically removed as if a tumor were being removed from a patient, as these were initially considered by the intelligence analysts who gathered the intel to assist in putting together the initial war planning to be the most potent defending forces within the city, as again, the red zone was a major objective for the post-invasion colonization operations that were to occur after the victory in the invasion, as the Red Zone effectively was the Chi-Com equivalent of the American Green Zone, as this fortified colonial zone would take in the initial colonists and act as a springboard to colonization and economic exploitation of the land. As it pertained to the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion, an unexpected event occurred wherein the militia force known to be located within the general northern fringes of the city had a pre-designated assembly and muster point in case of a grid or communications down or both type situation, and as these armed militiamen left their homes with weapons in hand, including some heavy weapons, they gathered at the major road junction of State Highway 349 and Big Spring Street, which bisected the city as a major thoroughfare and led out of it to the north and to the south, as Big Spring Street was effectively to be a major logistical route for the headquarters and support company of the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion in order to truck supplies that would be badly needed to the combat companies of their battalion operating in the city. The flanks would have to be cleared of this menace, as there were 7 combat companies and the headquarters and support company making up the battalion. 1 combat company would be shed off of the vehicle column to deal with this threat in order to clear the route for the logistics to freely flow into the city, as the remaining 6 companies would bypass this battle and begin to encircle the city like so, as they would form a sort of star pattern around the city, with 3 companies going all the way down Big Spring Street before peeling off, with 1 company moving towards the southwestern portion of the cordon, another company going down Big Spring Street moving toward the southeast portion of the cordon, and 1 company forming the southern portion of the cordon, while the other 2 companies would cordon the north, as the 6th company, which would be the first company in the procession, would race into the middle of the city itself in the downtown and begin to assault the key paramilitary buildings, as this was a major surgical operation to remove the American security forces and the threat they posed. This operation, occurring exactly at 1 a.m., would be a shock and awe surprise operation, as the paramilitary shock forces of the People's Armed Police would strike fast and they would strike hard against their targets in the city, as they would rapidly move in towards the American paramilitary offices, wherein roughly 700 total American paramilitary forces had been deployed, as America had mobilized many of its military, National Guard, and reservists to bolster the security in the country, as the Sino-Russian naval drills were occurring off both coasts, although satellite dazing had concealed the buildup of the external invasion forces occurring in Canada and Mexico before the satellites were kinetically destroyed by the ASAT strikes. The forces that were inside of the city of the paramilitary variety had been built up to add to the security of key sites and structures and infrastructure located throughout the Midland and Odessa area, and thus they were primary targets of the People's Armed Police, who would strike them again very fast and very hard, rolling in to attack the buildings in a daring building assault, smashing their way through vehicles and other obstacles in the parking lot to roll their troops up very close to these buildings where they could offload them and in tactical formations storm the building, as the People's Armed Police were highly tactically astute, very aggressive, and had a high tempo of operations at all times, and were well trained not just in grappling, but also rappelling techniques with their ropes. They would conduct these building assaults and fight their way into these buildings and gradually clear them of any and all opposition located within as they move through the building in their tactical formations in terms of their stack teams, as each squad would break down into half squad stack teams and maneuver through these structures to carry out the clearance operations. Again, this battle would occur in two phases. Phase 1 would see the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion encircling the city in a ring of steel, with also a company out of the 6 devoted to this operation clearing out the paramilitary forces located within the city, while the Armored Battalion, though moving slower, arriving at the major junction of State Highway 250 and Interstate 20, would deploy 2 of its combat companies, 1 armored infantry company, and most of a light tank company of the Type 62G or Type 62 Guy light tanks to guard this position, as it was a vital road that led directly to Big Spring, Texas, where the external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 1 through 6, as well as the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army, were set to arrive at their major logistical dump that was concealed in Big Spring, as they required this to continue their rapid drive inland from the border at Mexico, as the fuel and armaments and other deposits of supplies at this location in Big Spring, which boasted their logistical resupply dump, was absolutely vital and could not be interfered with in any way, shape, or form. Therefore, a major road such as Interstate 20 leading out of Midland into the east had to be defended at all costs to prevent any type of defending forces from potentially interfering with the logistical operations of the external invasion prong. Therefore, the Armored Battalion would not only defend this particular road junction, but the Light Tank Company, as a Light Tank Company and Armored Infantry Company were tasked with this operation, would shed off a single platoon of Type 62Gs to seize and secure the effectively abandoned Ryan Aerodrome, as it was at this time effectively empty, as there were no people located in it, and was able to be taken and held with ease by a single combat platoon of light tanks, while the remaining 5 combat companies, as of course the headquarters and support company, would remain on their CCP regime ranch property to run supplies to their combat forces, would see the remaining 5 combat companies advancing to the east-facing portion of the cordon created by the spread-out vehicles and troops of the combat companies defending this part of the cordon, whereby the 5 remaining combat companies, which would consist of 3 light tank companies and 2 armored infantry companies, would break up into individual vehicles, as 2 companies, 1 tank and 1 armored infantry, would effectively break into groups of 30 total 2-vehicle groups, which would consist of a light tank taking up the front, almost acting in an assault gun capacity, as following behind them would be an armored infantry vehicle, whether the more numerous Type 63 armor personnel carriers boasting their powerful 12.7mm W85 machine gun, or even the infantry fighting vehicles of each platoon in some cases, which had the more powerful turret-based weaponry of the 30mm autocannon, as well as also a 7.62 by 54mm coaxial machine gun, and even the shorter-range HJ-73C ATGM, as the troops would be dismounted on either side of their armored infantry vehicles, be it the APC or IFVs, to effectively add firepower with interlocking fields of fire to defend their own vehicles from attacks by Molotov cocktails and even stronger weapons, as the previous installation had shown in Part 6, that the militia force would be engaged in battle by a single combat company of light mechanized infantry troops that were shed off to clear this flank to allow for the ease of logistics by road through this area. which effectively caused some of these militiamen to retreat into the city of Midland, adding to the total number of defenders inside of the city, as approximately a total of 160 militiamen will have, by the time of the initiation of hostilities on the ground in the north of Midland at 12:30, have already fled into Midland, with the wheel-based light mechanized infantry companies hot on their tail to conduct their encirclement as well as their building assaults in the city to clear out the paramilitary defenders. This effectively was phase one of the operation. Again, conduct a ring of steel or an envelopment around the downtown area and some of the outer lying areas to prevent any defending forces from escaping, while also accompany, again, flushing out and annihilating the paramilitary defenders, which was phase one. Phase two would be the combat companies from the armored battalion, numbering 5, again, breaking into their groups of 2 vehicles on each street to move through and clear the pocket, while one of the 3 committed light tank companies would move down Big Spring Street to cut the pocket in half, with the spread out 4 companies, again 2 light tank and 2 armored infantry, with 2 vehicles each on each street, moving down the streets to clear the first half of the pocket, by which point the light mechanized infantry companies guarding this part of the pocket would then fold in and act as QRF, or quick reaction or quick response forces, to assist the armored troops as they flush the rest of the pocket of defenders. As before the invasion, intelligence gathered had assumed that there would be a sizable number of armed reactionary civilians in the area as well, and the intelligence would prove correct, as over 500 armed reactionary civilians within the pocket would rise up to try to challenge the invasion forces. Once again, they were reactionary armed civilians, meaning they were simply reacting to the situation as it developed, as they wanted to take on the invaders without any forethought or planning, as well as without any capable or credible logistical systems, without any centralized command and control, without weapons standardization, which would mean easier logistics if they even had a logistical system in the first place, as well as also no actionable intel to tailor any coherent defensive planning. As it pertained to all the different groups of defenders, whether it was the armed reactionary civilian elements that were gradually rising up inside of the cordon to attack the invasion forces, whether it was the American militia forces that fled from the north and into the city where they would try to put up a defense, or whether it was the American paramilitary forces that were located within the city, most of which being in or around their buildings. These forces had no cohesion, coordination, or organization, as they all had different chains of command, as the paramilitary forces were effectively American regime security forces and operated under their own chain of command, and the militia forces were their own force with their own chain of command and their own logistical system as well. And the armed reactionary civilians simply grabbed whatever firearms were available to them and took to the streets to engage the attackers, the invasion forces. And of course, these were the least effective out of all of the defending forces that were available inside of the city. And again, as the PAP would assault the city, the intelligence gathered and implemented into the overwar planning had already made the correct presumption about the armed reactionary civilians rising up to challenge the People's Armed Police, and therefore the clearance of the city would become necessary in phase 2 of the operation, which was the combat companies from the armored battalion moving in to effectively set up to prepare to clear the city, and they would clear the pocket in 2 pushes. As it pertained to artillery, the artillery battalion within the 2nd Brigade, responsible for the Midland side of the battle space, would
relay and reposition its howitzers after shooting new azimuths of fire after first hitting American military targets around the airport as it pertained to the Midland International Air and Spaceport, and would not only assist in the bombardment of the American militia forces just north and outside of the city, but would also help with supporting directly the fighting going on to capture the soon to be red zone, which was the downtown of Midland itself. As the downtown was mostly off limits to artillery fire and airstrikes, there were some exceptions, such as garages, which were some of the strongest available civil structures which could handle intense artillery strikes, as well as also the many parks which dotted the city, including in downtown. If there were targets located in these areas, they were open to direct artillery bombardment, as the rest of the downtown, as it has had many important buildings to the People's Armed Police, was generally off limits and would need to be taken in a highly surgical and efficient manner to preserve the buildings for the future colonization base of operations as the red zone. Airstrikes again would also be highly limited in the downtown area, although there would be some strafing attacks that would be permitted by fighter aircraft, such as the Iranian Air Force's F 14 Tomcats, using their 20 millimeter Vulcan cannon to lay down a rain of steel on targets below, completely shredding them to pieces. Of course, the even more advanced and much more capable J-35A fifth generation fighters of the PLAAF would be conducting their combat air patrols over the battle space to ensure no interference from American fixed-wing aircraft, as by the time this battle for the heart of Midland would erupt, the entirety of the USAF, U.S. Marine Corps Aviation, and U.S. Naval Aviation will have not, as of yet, been totally destroyed, as that hour would come between 5 and 5:30 a.m. For the time being, the skies over the battle space would have to be vigorously patrolled by these aircraft to ensure that there would be no interference with the orbiting AWACS aircraft, which was the KJ-2000, which directed most of the air operations in this particular zone of the south central invasion sector of the country, as well as also defending the orbiting Y-9LG electronic warfare / electronic intelligence gathering aircraft. As the first phase already was beginning at 1 a.m., there would be different portions of the city that would see combat immediately before all of the armed reactionary civilians will have exited their homes and prepared to fight, although the first battles would see sporadic contact with armed reactionary civilians that were just beginning to emerge. The rest would gradually emerge as the battle would go on, as the armored companies would not arrive in place until about 3 a.m., or effectively 3 hours into the invasion, and 2 hours into the battle over the downtown, as the battle for downtown Midland will have begun by 1 a.m., with the major building assaults being carried out by a single combat company of the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion, broken up into its different platoons, as well as also the encirclement of much of the downtown and uptown areas by other companies of light mechanized infantry from the same battalion. As we go to the maps of the areas of initial contact, small unit engagements would occur during the encirclement operations to encircle the city, as well as also the battles against the paramilitary forces in and around their major buildings where they were deployed in this area. Over time, the militia forces who had already fled into the city would make contact with some of the clusters of armed reactionary civilians and fight alongside of them, and even, in some cases, even assist paramilitary forces, as some of them would escape their buildings only to be swept up later by the arriving armored forces tasked with mopping up the pocket that was created by the light mechanized infantry encirclement. In the northwest of this portion of the battle space of the city of Midland, A minor objective, which was the local municipal airport, would become part of the northwest facing portion of the encirclement as a single combat company of light mechanized infantry coming under State Highway 250 would break off of the vehicle column to encircle their portion of the overall encirclement, while other companies carried out their portions of the encirclement. For the time being, things would be somewhat quiet in the western end of the pocket, although as the armored forces would arrive on scene, there would be American defenders trying to break out of the encirclement who would be engaged vigorously and destroyed by the armored forces and light mechanized infantry troops holding this part of the cordon. But initially at 1 a.m., the first battles would include the fighting around the municipal airport area as the first company in this portion of the battle space moved in to conduct their portion of the encirclement, with other fighting occurring in the southwest-facing portion of the encirclement, and of course in the heart of the city in two specific areas. There would be the battle around the De Niro building at the far northern fringes of downtown, leading into the uptown area, which was a free fire zone, while the downtown was strictly off limits to artillery and airstrikes, as heavy firepower was denied to these places, with rare exceptions. The De Niro building would effectively be assaulted and kept intact, although areas immediately around it would be sanctioned for air and artillery strikes, as there would be threats coming from mostly armed reactionary civilians and paramilitary forces in just this particular area by 1 a.m. Immediately to the south, near Older Business 20, which ran through the downtown area, the Federal Courthouse, which was also the headquarters building for the U.S. Marshal Services in the area and was also immediately adjacent to the U.S. Post Office building, which was the city's main post office, would come under heavy assault by two platoons of the company tasked with conducting these building assaults. As it pertained to other important regime buildings, such as the City Hall and courthouse annexes and even the local municipal courthouses, they would be cleared later by the advance of the armored forces through the city tasked with conducting the clearance operations. These two vehicles each going down the street, one from a light tank company's platoon and one from an armored infantry's platoon, as this was the standard on each street, would roll down the street with the main gun and coax machine gun facing ahead, while the turret machine gunner would have a 180-degree field of fire protecting both vehicles to the right, or in some cases to the left, while the follow-up APC, or even in some cases the IFV, as each platoon had an IFV, would face the other side opposite to the tank machine gunner, and they would cover the vehicles from the other side. And the squad in each APC or IFV would dismount and break into two half squads with 5 personnel on one side and 5 on the other, sometimes carrying heavy weapons like their Type 73 flamethrowers, which were a true terror weapon from the standpoint of the devastation they could do both to property and to bodies, as these weapons would be wielded by the PAP shock troops. They would also have their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, both with anti-armor and anti-personnel ammunition, stocked to the brim within their APC or IFV in each group of vehicles, as well as also a copious amount of hand grenades, as well as tube-fired 35mm grenades, as each squad had a man with a 35mm grenade tube beneath his QBZ-95 assault rifle, as well as also the squad's light machine gunner, equipped with the QBJ-201 light machine gun, as these dismounted troops would add to the fields of fire on either side, mutually supporting their vehicle-based firepower, with the vehicle-based firepower also supporting them on either side. They would be able to defend against any attackers in the rubble heaps trying to carry out attacks with Molotov cocktails, which were a very effective weapon only if they were close enough to actually hit the vehicles, or also being attacked by far more potent weapons, such as those equipping the militia forces, which would include heavy machine gun fire, as well as also weapons like the PSRL-1 American-made rocket-propelled grenades that were effectively siphoned off of stocks that were gifted to a certain Eastern European nation during the Great Eastern European Proxy Conflict, which were sold by shady Eastern European arms dealers to Mexican cartels, who in turn turned around and sold these weapons back into American hands, although they ended up in the civilians' hands and not in the government or regime's hands. And these weapons and others like them, as they also had AT-4s and other anti-armor weapons, and even anti-tank guided missiles, would be effective weapons to utilize against the Chi-Com vehicles, as the PAP would have to fend off vicious attacks by rocket-propelled grenades, AT-4 fire, even NLAWs or regular LAWs, which a LAW was a light anti-armor weapon, which could barely penetrate the armor of a Type 62G light tank, let alone the Type 63 armor personnel carrier, as the Type 62G had very strong armor for a light tank and could resist most types of weaponry minus anti-tank guided missiles, and certain anti-armor weapons as the AT-4 could penetrate if hit in certain parts of the tank turret, of course. But for the most part, they had FY4 explosive reactive armor, and the base armor was already considerably strong, and heavy machine guns, such as the M250 cals, could not penetrate these light tanks whatsoever at all, nor could they penetrate the Type 86G, or Guy, or improved in Mandarin, Type 86G infantry fighting vehicles. However, the heavy machine guns, such as the M250 cal, could be a threat to the APCs, such as the Type 63, especially if hit in the back or on the top armor, although the side and front armor was relatively robust. These American militia troops would be by far the best equipped American defending forces located within the downtown of Midland. Next to them, of course, being the more moderately equipped American paramilitary forces that did have 50 caliber weapons, such as their Barrett sniper rifles and also M250 cals issued to them by the U.S. federal regime. However, they lacked any effective anti-armor capabilities or anti-tank guided missiles in the form of anti-armor or anti-tank weaponry, and therefore, as the 50 caliber weapons were their best weapons, they would try to employ these in the most effective manner possible. However, this would be extremely difficult, as these forces came under a very swift and surgical attack by the brutally efficient People's Armed Police shock troops. By 1 a.m., as the militiamen that had fled from the battlefield just to the north, which was now effectively kicking into high gear as the rest of their militia was coming under heavy assault just north of the city, and the rest had moved in. Some of them would disperse into different areas of the city, and as the battle would wear on, they would break down into smaller and more effective teams for hit-and-run type assaults, with their heavy weapons, of course, and would deal considerable damage to the People's Armed Police troops fighting to seize control of their major objective, being the red zone of downtown, as there were many other objectives in the process of being fought over at this point in the battle, as it was still very early. The fighting for the objective of the downtown of Midland, only now just beginning, would see a number of small unit actions again occurring throughout the battle space. As the People's Armed Police light mechanized infantry moved into the area, they destroyed everything in their way, including unarmed civilians who just happened to be on the road at the time. And as the clock struck 1, if we go to the map of the area containing the municipal airport, to the north was State Highway 250, which is part of the ring road around the city alongside of Interstate 20 in the south. As 250 ringed the city, including this part in the north, this being Big Spring Street on the far edge of the map, would see three combat companies after the first company that made it in would carry out their building assaults by 1 a.m. sharp. The remaining three companies racing down Big Spring Street would again take the southwest, southeast, and southern portions of the cordon. As this map opens up, the last of the three companies racing to their cordon positions in the south is now moving in, as the company moving in to conduct their portion of the cordon is now in this particular area. As armed reactionary civilians had been told in these nearby neighborhoods that were just to the south of this area and just to the west of this area, immediately off the map, that the invasion forces were now moving into and through the area and were thus getting prepared to carry out attacks against the People's Armed Police shock troops moving in. As some of the militiamen had also entered this area, there would be 3 militia technicals moving in and crossing this canal bridge and into the local community college campus, where they would drop off their squad-sized elements of 8 to 10 men who would take up positions both around the buildings and within them themselves to fire rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns out of these buildings, using them as fighting positions against the People's Armed Police headquarters troops that had now moved in to the municipal airport grounds, as they took position in the municipal airport when it was effectively abandoned at this time, as it was 1 a.m. in the morning, or just 1 hour into the nationwide invasion. Nobody was effectively on the airport premises at this time, making it very easy for the People's Armed Police company that was taking up this part of the cordon to move their headquarters platoon of their company into this area where they would take up a defensive diamond formation and even disembark their maintenance company, which were their mechanics effectively. These were the non-combat logistical and command elements of the combat company of light mechanized infantry. Their maintenance section would go about clearing all these buildings, and as the map opens up, they begin by moving in to clear this building in 2 half squads, as 5 men move in to clear this building, this building, this building, moving around then and having this squad that took position alongside of the buildings to provide them fire support from the outside according to building clearance procedures, would see this squad then moving in here while this squad moved around as they cleared the last building. As the headquarters platoon had moved behind their company elements, their combat platoons, they moved down Big Spring Street before turning onto Veterans Air Park Drive, or lane here rather, before moving into crossing this bridge and into the airport grounds before they set up their diamond formation. Following behind them was a single combat platoon of their 3 total combat platoons who peeled off and went down A Street as the headquarters platoon entered the premises to take control of the airport grounds, as this again was a subordinate objective within the larger objective of the city of Midland. As 2 additional combat platoons of the total of 3 had also peeled off coming underneath Highway 250 and had taken the access road the wrong way before coming off the access road and rolling alongside the northern perimeter of the airport fencing of the airport grounds. As they moved into the area again, they fired indiscriminately at civilian vehicles which were already on the roads at this time, completely obliterating them as they moved through the area. As they came up to this point here, they had a brief exchange of fire between this armored personnel carrier and a grouping of 5 armed reactionary civilians running up this particular embankment, as the highway had an overpass right here, and this was the embankment that they were trying to move up, whereupon they were fired at and destroyed by the PAP vehicles moving through this particular area at this particular time. Again, it has to be understood at all times that the coalition forces had a complete and total iron grip over this entire battle space with their vehicle crew and dismounted squad level quadcopter assets, as each and every vehicle crew and dismounted squad had their own quadcopter assets, as well as also the combat data links being the vehicle-based combat data links and the handheld combat data links for each squad level NCO and up in rank, and they could see each and everything that was going on the map at any given time as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, or effectively the Sino-Russian AI combat cloud, was crunching various domains of data, including the ISR data, which was gathered from everything from radar to reconnaissance drones to spy planes and more, and all of it being fed into the AI and processed in real time, which also included the real-time positions of friendly and enemy forces, as everything on the map was seen, including the American armed reactionary civilians moving in from this neighborhood before these troops even arrived into the area. They were all seen, a total of 25 of them at this moment, moving into the college campus of the local community college in the south by Windlands Park here, with another neighborhood just south and off this map. Another grouping of approximately 20 armed reactionary civilians moved into this area to attack this platoon coming down A Street, which was about to turn onto Wadley Avenue to rejoin the rest of their company's combat platoons, which were now making the turn onto Garfield Street right here. As they were turning onto this area, this APC had lit up these 5 armed reactionary civilians, which had simple small arms, and completely tore them to pieces with heavy machine gun fire from their 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun on the turret. As this occurred and the vehicles began to turn onto Garfield Street, they were to move into the area and drop off a single platoon out of the 2 platoons of dismounts and have these dismounts assault and clear the college campus of any and all armed reactionary civilian and militia elements. There were also militia forces in the area as well, as there were 2 vehicles here which had dropped off armed reactionary civilians and 2 vehicles that had dropped off 2 groups of 5 militiamen each. These forces were already exchanging fire with the vehicles in the defensive diamond formation around the lighter logistical vehicles and command vehicles of the light mechanized infantry company's headquarters platoon that were in this defensive diamond formation. The up-armored EQ 2050 with the 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun turret was the company captain's vehicle himself, and there were 4 Tiger MRAPs, which were considerably strong armored vehicles, albeit not as strong as the APCs and IFVs of the WZ551 varieties, which equipped their combat platoons, but the headquarters platoons, MRAPs, could still put up a considerable fight with their 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns. And they would, for a time, exchange heavy fire with the armed reactionary civilians and militia groupings in this particular area, as the militiamen between these buildings on the campus, as well as the armed reactionary civilians between buildings on the campus, such as in this animation or illustration, if you will, where they're firing over this car they're using as concealment, as well as this man right here firing in this direction between this dumpster and the car. They're using the car as concealment, but are getting return fire, which is tearing through the flimsy materials of the car, as well as a hand grenade coming into this area from the PAP, which would no doubt blast these personnel to pieces, one man already being hit in the head and dropping his AK variant on the ground while this man's throwing a Molotov cocktail. They are between these buildings exchanging heavy fire at the headquarters platoon of the People's Armed Police Combat Company, attempting to conduct their encirclement operation by establishing their portion of the overall cordon in this area, as this area had to be cleared as it was a direct threat to their occupation now of the airport grounds and the headquarters platoon, which were the command and logistics of the whole company itself. The combat platoons moving down Garfield Street here would stop and disembark one of their 2 platoons of dismounts to sweep and clear the area of the militiamen and armed reactionary civilian presence. As in the south, in the Windlands Park, combat was already underway as this platoon was moving down at the same time as these actions were occurring, and the lead IFV version of the WZ-551s of the platoon were laying down heavy fire with their 30 millimeter autocannon, as well as fire from their 7.62 by 54 millimeter coaxial machine gun at these two technicals, which belonged to armed reactionary civilians moving into the area on Wadley Avenue, rather. And as the armed reactionary civilians varied in terms of their quality and equipment, some actually had full on proper military body armor, which would protect them from small arms fire, some with SAPI plates, but others with the more robust and powerful steel plates, which could protect them from potent firepower, and others with Kevlar helmets to protect from shrapnel, and certain ammunition at certain times, depending on how far away the ammunition was fired and what type of ammunition. These, by far, were the best equipped of the armed reactionary civilians with personal protective equipment. Others had basic plate carriers, which was better than nothing at all, while others yet still had absolutely nothing, which was the vast majority of the armed civilians in this area. And that made them extremely easy to destroy by all of the firepower available to the People's Armed Police, as the two technicals of armed civilians, with armed civilians in the bed firing over their truck as well as others in the cab, they were destroyed rapidly by the firepower of the lead IFV version of the WZ-551, as the potent 30 millimeter autocannon and even 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax machine gun shredded their vehicles to absolute scrap and twisted metal, as well as also throwing body parts in many directions. These armed civilians were wiped out instantaneously, while the others gathered in the park, hiding amid the trees and undergrowth of this park, were trying to use this as concealment to lay down an ambush against these vehicles turning onto the street. However, they were all seen by the quadcopter assets as they moved from their neighborhood and into the park, and it was known that they were here, and fire was promptly exchanged at them after these technicals were obliterated, as the tactical planning ordered by the company captain called for direct support from this platoon as well as these two platoons to clear this area of hostiles, which would mean that this combat platoon turning onto Wadley would have to cross this canal and effectively position themselves here to L-vector fire to support the dismounts moving into the area, as these vehicles would have fields of fire covering this area, and then these vehicles would have fields of fire covering this area, presenting an L-vector of firepower. As these vehicles moved down Wadley Avenue relatively slowly, they laid down fire on these two buildings as they took a rocket-propelled grenade, which was fired directly at them, but sailed right through the lead IFV and the follow-up APC WZ-551 as they were moving just fast enough to where it was difficult to get a straight shot with the rocket-propelled grenade on target. And the firepower returned with heavy machine gun fire, and 30 millimeter autocannon fire was very prompt and deadly, and blasted some of the personnel that were taking a position in these buildings trying to fire out at the passing vehicles. These buildings soon enough would be struck by devastating cannon artillery fire, as 20 minutes into the battle, by 1:20 a.m., after all the previous artillery fire had concluded against other targets, which included even targets that were underway to the north and just on the northern fringes of the city, as in Part 6, the militia group where these militiamen had come from was taking a massive beating just outside of the city by artillery, loitering munitions, and more from the battle with other light mechanized infantry forces of a single company shed off of the same battalion to deal with those forces that were north and outside of the city. The artillery could now reorient its fire to support the other forces now carrying out phase 1 of the operation that were inside of the city itself. And other loitering munitions were already joining the fray, but were hitting targets in other parts of the city, as the armored battalion's headquarters and support company also had its own combat drone section. And while the combat drone section of the light mechanized infantry battalion had fired all 48 of their loitering munitions to strike targets of militiamen at the road junction of 349 and Big Spring Street, just north and outside of the city, the loitering munitions fired by the armored battalion's combat drone section and their headquarters and support company on their CCP regime property would fly in to hit paramilitary forces and other targets inside of the city at this time. As this battle was unfolding within this 1 mile east west by 1 kilometer north south area of the city to establish the northwest part of the cordon, in the heart of the city, in the northernmost fringes of downtown, where effectively downtown petered out into an uptown area, the De Niro Plaza, which contained the offices of the IRS paramilitary forces and the DEA paramilitary forces, was coming under swift assault at the same time that the fighting was going on to the northwest, where the local municipal airport was, as the platoons had broken off of their company to carry out these building assaults, with the headquarters platoon of the company assigned to conduct the building assaults taking position in this parking area in a defensive diamond to protect their lighter vehicles, while one combat platoon rapidly smashed their way into the parking lot around the building and dismounted their troops to carry out a building assault, with this vehicle rapidly flying off a big spring street, smashing through cars, pushing them aside as if they were nothing, rolling all the way up to the building to disembark their troops to clear the building, while behind the building these troops were carrying out an assault by using grappling to get into upper floors, while this squad took the lower floor on this side, and the remaining two squads that were outside of the building took up defensive positions to guard against any attacks, along with the headquarters platoon to the north, with fields of fire covering all directions to defend the building assault. To the south, approximately a mile away, deep in downtown, was an area where another building assault was occurring, with the other two combat platoons of the same company carrying out the assault on De Niro Plaza, as they surrounded the entire post office and court and U.S. Marshal Service complex, which this was a massive federal complex. One platoon took this side, the other platoon off map surrounded the other parking area that was immediately off map and outside of the building, where there was no fighting going on just off this map. But there would be fighting in this particular area, as they would not only conduct building assaults against paramilitary forces holding out inside of these buildings, but would also have to effectively destroy paramilitary forces that managed to flee the area before the PAP showed up, just as they were rolling in, as some paramilitary forces had crossed the street and entered this parking garage and got on the very top level to fire down upon the PAP, who would promptly return heavy fire with everything from their flamethrowers, rocket-propelled grenades, even HJ-08 ATGMs, as well as also some of the loitering munitions launched by the headquarters and support company's combat drone section from the armored battalion, which was a different battalion, were coming in to strike targets as well. And again, artillery was sanctioned for use in Centennial Park to hit clusters of armed reactionary civilians in the area, as many others were running frantically throughout the downtown to seek refuge and shelter of the armed civilian varieties. Some would enter the Bush Convention Center, others would enter this parking garage, some would even get on the roof and be targeted by artillery, and there would be others elsewhere. Some paramilitary forces tried to flee just to the south and off this map where the county jail was to seek shelter in the county jail, but would be destroyed by artillery strikes as they fled across these railroad tracks. There was a motor pool set up here of Max Pro MRAPs that belonged to the paramilitary forces within the buildings, which would also be hit by loitering munitions at the opening of this map, as they were already destroyed, as they were encapsulated in red, just like these. These were already hit at the opening. The two platoon-sized gun truck elements of Max Pro MRAPs here spread out were already destroyed at the opening of the map by loitering munition strikes, with the rest of the loitering munitions seeking other targets. Armed reactionary civilians were in this bank building, as well as, again, fleeing into the convention center and nearby buildings, such as hotels and office buildings in the area. Paramilitary forces were across the street from the post office, and in the post office and in the court buildings as well. Heavy fighting was already breaking out at 1 a.m. in these areas, including just to the north, again, about a mile in the De Niro Plaza area, as well as the encirclement beginning on the edges of the 5-mile envelopment. which included the northwest containing the local municipal airport, which itself was a subordinate objective of some importance as it could be used as a critical combat outpost for controlling the city later after the invasion, as it was now occupied by PAP troops of the headquarters platoon of this light mechanized infantry company, having had moved into the area. The remaining combat platoons were in the process of doing the mopping up to be able to then move on and complete the encirclement after this short-lived battle, which would only last 45 minutes in this area, as again, this battle and these battles had effectively initiated at the same time. These were effectively small unit engagements for the most part, as the emergence of defending forces, as well as the arrival of defending forces from militia in the north of the city, were effectively a very chaotic scene at the very opening of this battle. But gradually, resistance would stiffen and solidify as the different types of defenders would try to work together to the best of their ability, although friendly fire incidences would be somewhat frequent, as the three different types of defending forces had no actionable intelligence and no communication, no coordination. They didn't share the same command structure, and most of the time had no idea that one another were in the same area unless they directly bumped into one another, which would allow them to try to communicate and coordinate defensive operations against the invasion forces. For the time being, however, as the battle was just initiating, and as it was said, everything was highly chaotic at the very opening. There would even be fighting relatively early on as the southwest portion of the cordon was being established, as there would be an attack from outside of the cordon and from within it, mostly by armed reactionary civilians, but also there would be some militia forces, rather, in this area as well, acting alongside of armed reactionary civilians to attack both sides of the cordon in what was called the Watersong Wild Space area, which was effectively a nature area in between an industrial / business zone, which contained some lakes and ponds, as well as a stream, and I-20, which bordered the south of this wilderness area, and also a lake just to the south and outside of I-20, including more wooded areas as well to the south of I-20. Within the wild space, however, in the parking area, both militia technicals and armed reactionary civilian technicals had pulled into the area and dismounted their personnel, who tried to seek concealment throughout the nature and wooded areas, and some would even try to take positions in some of these industrial buildings, as there were many oil field related industries such as valve companies and others in this area, with workshops, factories, and distribution centers. To the north of the railroad tracks, an older business 20 here, was the hotel and convention center, a U-Haul rental place, as well as a car rental place, and also RV related businesses. And there was also a car dealership right here in this area. There would be heavy fighting in some of these industrial sites, as well as also in the nature space itself, the Watersong Wild Space. And the cordon, as the vehicles spread out to create their cordon, spread out wide along Old 20, and some continued off of the Old 20 route and moved up Midland Drive here, spread out widely. And some would disembark their troops both to clear surrounding buildings of defending possible enemy forces, as well as also to attack to the south, as they would carry out a counterattack against this haphazard attack from both sides, as the attack carried out by the defenders was not coordinated, as again no communications existed between the group of forces to the south of the cordon force and to the north of the cordon force, and therefore they could not effectively coordinate their attacks. However, if they would have had the ability to communicate, they could have been far more successful in this endeavor than they were otherwise, as they were decisively defeated. Had they had communications, they possibly could have taken some PAP vehicles with them. However, they would not succeed in this, as the cordon would hold, and it would hold firmly, as the PAP counterattacks into the industrial areas and the wild space would be vicious, as well as against the militiamen holed up inside of the hotel. as the fighting in the southwest of the cordon would again begin after 1 a.m., while the fighting in the northwest of the cordon around the municipal airport, as well as in the heart of the city against the two major paramilitary sites, happened immediately at 1 a.m. These would be the earliest instances of combat within the battle that was unfolding in the city of Midland, as more battles would erupt even later, as by 3 a.m., again, the armored forces will have already set up their four attacking companies for the clearance operation, as well as also sending in one light tank company from the north down Big Spring Street to spread out and block any defending forces from coordinating or communicating with each other by splitting the pocket in half and allowing for one side to be cleared at a time through two different pushes as they would move through in a highly methodical and gradual way, and would ensure, as the city was gradually being reduced to rubble outside of the no fire zone, in the free fire zone, which was to be struck viciously by airstrikes from both the Iranian Air Force Su 24s as well as also the PLAAF JH-7 strike aircraft, as well as artillery of the PAP's own artillery from their Type 83 towed 122mm howitzers, which comprised most of the battalion's firing batteries. The 6 firing batteries were comprised of these howitzers, with a single firing battery comprised of the more powerful 130mm Type 59-I or -1 howitzers, now fully reoriented and relayed with different azimuths of fire to contribute to the support of their forces battling for control of the city itself. And as, again, the uptown areas were to be considered free fire zones, these areas would be hit heavily by artillery fire, airstrikes, and more, reducing much of the outer rim of the downtown to complete and total ruins, which would serve two purposes. It would indeed wipe out many non-combatant lives, as the PAP had absolutely no regard for them whatsoever at all, and would also destroy a number of combatants. But on the flip side, or on the other side of the coin, it would give the remaining defending forces positions that could possibly give them some advantages in combat. It would allow them to get relatively close to the invading forces where they could utilize their Molotov cocktails, as well as also the militia's weapons, which were far more capable in the form of their limited number of ATGMs, their heavy machine guns, as well as their light anti-armor weapons like their PSRL-1 RPGs, as well as also their AT-4s, to a better advantage. The sewer system would give them the best advantage of all, however, as they would be able to come up out of some of the manhole covers and effectively lay anti-tank mines immediately in front of the tanks where they could not even see, as they were too close to be able to observe anything. And this even went for some of their quadcopter drone capabilities, as they would come up immediately out of the manholes right before a tank was about to cross over the manhole and lay the mine and quickly disappear before the mine went off. These type of tactics and others would serve the militia relatively well, as they would contribute to the damages and impeding some of the PAP operations, or at least slowing them down by destroying some of the tracks on these vehicles with mines, forcing them to effectively have to come and repair their tracks, or in some cases even tow vehicles entirely back to their headquarters command posts of their headquarters platoons. As each platoon had their own maintenance section and recovery assets, some of these vehicles would have to be brought back. As it pertained to the paramilitary forces, they would fight as hard as possible to defend their relative buildings from the heavy attacks coming in against them by the People's Armed Police shock troops, as the building assaults, again, would be very vicious and very rapid in terms of how they conducted these assaults and strikes against the paramilitary forces, which they had sought to surgically remove, again, like a tumor, from the city. As when they tailored the original war planning. It was the paramilitary forces, as they were monitored being deployed to these areas, that were seen as the highest threat level, at least for capturing the heart of Midland itself, as this is where they were deployed. And the intelligence analysts had placed a high priority on tailoring the mission around eradicating these very forces. However, as these were tier 2 threats in terms of the American paramilitary forces, they barely accounted for the armed reactionary civilian threat. Although they were well aware of it, they effectively did not regard these forces as a major threat. However, the biggest threat of all would not come from the American paramilitary elements, nor from the armed reactionary civilians, of course, but the biggest threat in the urban combat would come from the militia forces, as they were by far the best trained, best equipped, the most logistically competent and prepared, and the best led by far. They had the best capabilities out of all three types of defending forces. And although there were only 160 of them that effectively made it inside of the city, they by far would be the most effective out of the defenders. Again, initially, none of these different types of defenders knew that the other was operating in these areas, as again, they were different types of forces with different types of leadership and systems, and they would only work together when they encountered one another at close distance and were able to effectively communicate. As again, the ASAT cyber strikes and electronic warfare had removed all American ISR and communications capabilities, and there was no way for these different groups to effectively communicate except at very close ranges, where they would be forced to come into contact with each other at close range and would cluster together in groups, making them very easy targets for Chinese loitering munition strikes, artillery strikes, as well as also airstrikes and more. As the PAP shock troops were fighting hard already, the battle occurring in the northwest of the city around the municipal airport would only last a total of a mere 45 minutes, as this platoon coming down A Street had turned onto Wadley Avenue and had promptly eliminated the forces in the park, with only 2 escaping with their lives while still taking some heavy machine gun fire on their way deeper into the park. They would escape and get further into the city, where they would be later destroyed. Overhead, a pair of J-35As was conducting a standard combat air patrol over the battle space. And as these vehicles turned, while the fighter aircraft could have provided ground support, they were not used in this role, as their air superiority role was far more important over the battle space, to control the airspace around the entire area, not just the battle space, but beyond, as their beyond visual range capabilities were superb against enemy aircraft. And as these vehicles turned onto Wadley and moved, and again had taken some fire from RPG and machine gun fire from this building, they returned heavy fire against the building, as the headquarters platoon was also again laying down heavy fire into these buildings and also at these personnel that were between these buildings, causing these militiamen to be thoroughly annihilated, although they had fired general purpose machine guns such as M60s and 240 Bravos at these vehicles, and an RPG, which had caused extensive damage to this particular MRAP. They eventually were all wiped out by concentrated heavy machine gun fire, and these armed reactionary civilians would retreat into these buildings. In the north, only 4 personnel made it into these buildings, as they also had taken some machine gun fire, and 2 at the opening of the map were completely cut down by it, as they're completely encapsulated in red. This building has red around it. It was taking heavy fire. These buildings are fully encapsulated in red because they would be destroyed. Not only were they initially taking fire in an L vector from the combat platoon's WZ-551 vehicles, but also from the headquarters platoon shifting fire to the buildings, and then artillery shells coming in and crashing into these buildings and completely annihilating them. As it pertained to the other two combat platoons coming down into the area, after these forces had moved in, they deployed a platoon to effectively clear these buildings. As they tactically moved into the area, into the community college, one squad was clearing this building while the other squad moved up alongside of it as the buildings were being proceeded through by the stack teams, clearing them of enemy personnel. The other squad outside of the building would move up alongside of the building as the other squads in their stack teams moved through the buildings, clearing them of any and all defending forces that were located inside. And the buildings were cleared with a high degree of aggression and fanaticism, even involving bayonets against personnel, driving right through their ceramic sappy plates and body armor, disemboweling them and flaying them like a fish. As the PAP, again, were highly aggressive and fanatical fighters. They fought extremely hard for their regime and their leader, as Comrade G was effectively their emperor, and they would fight to the very end for his will to succeed in this invasion. They also were extremely loyal to Wei Fang, their new chief, as he was given a lateral promotion to command the People's Armed Police from his former position as defense minister and within the Politburo. As he was given this lateral promotion, his fanaticism and dreams of enslaving Americans to serve the CCP regime would come into fruition through his People's Armed Police conducting a brutal genocidal campaign throughout this invasion. They were far more fanatical and brutal than even the PLA, who were a professional military force who, for the most part, followed the Geneva Conventions. Of course, they committed collateral damage, as they called it, and they also were brutal fighters, but they, for the most part, did observe basic humanitarian law and also the Geneva Conventions when not in combat. As the People's Armed Police, again, were a fanatical paramilitary force, the Praetorian Guard of the CCP regime, they made their own rules, as they were not the official military, but they were their own military, as they were China's other military. They were the CCP regime's personal military, and they were who would carry out the most brutal acts throughout the country. Another fanatical paramilitary element of the coalition was the Iranian Pasdaran, who almost came close to the PAP in terms of their brutality levels in this overall invasion. However, the PAP by far was the most fanatical and brutal of them all. As the buildings were in the process of being cleared tactically by the People's Armed Police shock troops, the armed reactionary civilians that were within these buildings were surgically eliminated little by little. As the 25 that came in from a nearby neighborhood had moved into the campus, 10 had gone into this building and another 15 into this building. As the vehicles dropped them off, they laid down supporting fire initially with heavy machine gun fire, allowing their squads to bound and cover tactically forward. As this squad bounded, they laid down fire, then this squad bounded and laid down fire, and then finally this squad breached the building to clear it from the inside, while this squad bounded and covered outside to the south of these buildings to effectively come alongside of this building as it was being cleared by this squad, while this squad moved along the building to lay down supporting fire into the 10 armed civilians that went into this building, joined by 4 who moved from between these buildings into this building, numbering 14 total. As heavy fire was exchanged back and forth, it allowed for this squad to move from building to building tactically, with this squad in this wooded area bounding alongside of this building as this squad was clearing it out. And as this grouping, 4 personnel moved into this building, numbering 4 in this building and 14 in this building by now, this squad would have to assault this building and clear it of these 4 personnel, with this squad laying down supporting fire as they came around to aid in the clearance of this building. As they laid supporting fire down, this squad breached and cleared this building of the 4 personnel that were inside as they methodically moved through hallway by hallway, room by room, office by office, lobby by lobby. They hurled grenades into rooms and went into the rooms with a high degree of speed and efficiency and conducted their surgical clearance operations of the defenders that were located within. As they wiped out the 4 defenders, they prepared to move on to the next building, as they, now in this position, allowed for this squad to move up alongside and begin to destroy these cars, the 2 technicals that had been left by the militiamen that had been destroyed by the exchange of fire with the headquarters platoon's heavy weapons. They destroyed these vehicles with 35mm tube-fired grenades, rocket-propelled grenades, and a hefty dose of small arms fire from their TBJ-201 light machine gun, leaving many of these vehicles smoking or completely destroyed, resembling images like these, as they maneuvered their way tactically through the college campus grounds. As they moved up into position here and destroyed these vehicles, they allowed for this squad as well to penetrate and clear this building, as the heavy fire from this squad being laid down was being exchanged back and forth from the building and the squad, drawing the attention of most of the total of 14 defenders, minus a few who laid down some fire as the squad breached, allowing for the squad to come in effectively from behind and rapidly clear this building as well. At the same time as these actions were occurring, these 2 squads of the platoon in the north were moving quickly through these unoccupied buildings, clearing them with a high degree of speed, as there were 4 defenders in this building. By the time this squad got to this building and the squad prepared to move alongside of it, it laid down supporting fire, allowing the squad to breach and wipe out the 4 defenders inside, and allowing them to move alongside the building from outside to give support, if need be, to this squad who breached and cleared the building. As they had laid down some fire on the building from outside of it to allow the breaching operation, this building was rapidly cleared out as well. Once these areas were cleared and these buildings destroyed, along with the technicals parked outside, likewise hit by a potent barrage of 122mm shell fires and even a few 130mm shells rather from the Type 59-Is, all of the enemy technicals of the defending forces were put completely out of action, along with the personnel as well, as the last buildings were in the process of being cleared out of the armed reactionary civilian defenders. By which point, the squads of this single platoon would get back into their vehicles and continue to the south, preparing to spread out and occupy this part of the cordon, leaving their headquarters platoon to continue maintaining their command post inside of the recently captured municipal airport, which would effectively be the northern point of their company's cordon, as they would spread out in this area and their vehicles would spread widely apart, similar to how the vehicles are spaced in the southwestern part of the cordon. The same would occur in this area as well, vehicles starting here, spreading out wide in this area, being joined by this platoon. After they had been in this position, they would join and spread out through the area and would link up with the next company to their immediate south, forming the cordon. As there effectively were no defending forces in this particular area, just a fountain in the middle of Smith Road and Desta Road here, as well as also the Big Spring Street being the easternmost boundary. At the opening of this map, again, this was the last company moving south to conduct their portion of the cordon of the 3 companies and moved along Big Spring to get to their positions. This area was now completely flushed out of defending forces and now was completely under control, with the portion of the cordon established within merely 45 minutes or by 1:45 a.m. In the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines, the fighting that was occurring in the heart of the city that was happening in the downtown area, both in the southern edge of downtown against the U.S. Marshal Service building and federal courthouse and post office immediately adjacent, as well as to the north on the edges of downtown in the north at the De Niro Plaza will be covered in the next installation, as well as will be the fighting that occurred in the southwestern portion of the cordon that unfolded in the Watersong Wild Space portion of the southwestern cordon. As again, the battle was only getting started, with fighting occurring in these areas, with more to follow as the armored forces moved in to conduct the clearance operations of the entire pocket. More to come in the next video.